Good evening. I'm Miss Johnston, Miss McSherry, my son Jameson,
and I'm Mrs. Sourwine.
And we are coming to you live at 6 p.m. on every single night. We're going to start doing bedtime stories. So, as you can see, we are in Miss McSherry's bed with her son JMO, and we're going to read bedtime stories every night at this time. So you can always tune in and hear what book we're doing and all of the fun surprises that will come. So tonight we're going to finish Peter Pan. Almost forgot.
So friends, we're going to be reading chapters 16 and 17 tonight. So to remind you, in chapter 15, our chapter was Hook or Me this time. And it was the epic fight between Peter Pan and Captain Hook. We had the pirates versus the Lost Boys. And in the end, when Peter Pan fought Captain Hook went happily to the crocodile. So we now have Peter Pan, we have Wendy, John, Michael, and the Lost Boys after they win this big fight. And we're going to go ahead and start with chapter 16.
Yeah, so chapter 16 is called The Return Home. So you're thinking, after the fight, what are Peter, Tinkerbell, Wendy, Michael, John, what are they going to do? They're probably going to return home. So let's see what happens. Everyone woke up early the next day. It was a very long journey back home, and the sea was quite rough, so the going would be slow. With slight alterations from Wendy, the pirates' clothes fit the boys just fine. Pants cut off at the knee, and jaunty hats and eye patches. The scowls they added themselves. Peter, of course, was the captain. Nibs and John were first and second mates. Yeah. None of the boys had any training in sailing a pirate ship, but they pretended they did, which, in Neverland, is always enough. As they worked securing jibs and sheets and all sorts of other sailor words, they sang and cheered heartily. Finally, they got the ship out into the open sea, let loose her sails, and started for England. It was time. Peter had decided that they would sail as far as the Azore Islands and then fly the rest of the way. He stood at the wheel and addressed his pirate crew. "You scum," he cried, "you mangy dogs. There will be no mutiny on my ship, or else." The boys knew that Peter was only pretending to be a pirate, but unlike them, he couldn't always tell the difference. He was even wearing Hook's old clothes, and so they laughed, but nervously. "Let us leave the boys on the boat and travel back to the darlings' home." So right here, the narrator is telling the story, and they're talking about what happened with Wendy, John, Michael, Peter, and the Lost Boys. But now the narrator is moving back and now looking down at Mr. and Mrs. Darling and the family in England and telling what they're doing over there while Peter and the Lost Boys and Wendy, John, and Michael are still working their way back home. So let's see what the Darlings were doing. Yes, hello. Let us leave the boys on the boat and travel back to the Darlings' home. It seems a shame to have neglected them all this time, but Mrs. Darling wouldn't have wanted us to focus on her when we could instead be keeping an eye on her little ones. It would serve those naughty children right if their beds were not made, and their room was all dusty, and their parents weren't even home, having forgotten all about them. Of course, this is not the case. And this is the kind of thing children count on so they can have their adventures. The only difference from when they left is that Nana is no longer chained. Mr. Darling could admit when he was wrong. The second the children had flown, he had invited Nana back into the house where she had stayed. Then, however, he had done a most unusual thing. He had gone down on all fours and crawled into Nana's kennel himself. What? Mrs. Darling had begged him to come out, but he had said, "Not until the children come back." Every morning the kennel was carried with Mr. Darling in it to the office, and then back again at night. "This is my punishment, and it is proper," he thought. So let me make sure I understand this part. Mr. Darling, the dad, he's sleeping in the dog cage? Is that what's happening? Weird. So have you ever heard the phrase "in the doghouse"?
Yes.
Yeah. What does that phrase mean if someone's in the doghouse?
Sometimes I hear somebody say that, and I think it means that somebody is in trouble, like they did something wrong.
Yes, like when someone does something wrong, you might say that they're in the doghouse. That doesn't literally mean they're sleeping in a doghouse. It just means that they're kind of in trouble. They did something not so great, and now they're having like a punishment or being in trouble for what they did. So Mr. Darling is symbolizing being in the doghouse, because being in trouble for something. So he's going to say, "So come out when the children return." Given how much he cared what other people thought of him, it was a hard punishment indeed. People laughed and pointed, peering inside, and he became known as Darling in the Kennel. The true beauty of his sacrifice, however, shone through when the public learned why he had confined himself to Nana's kennel. They began to follow him, not to laugh, but to praise. Yeah, that's crazy, huh, Juma? Girls asked for his autograph. Society types invited him to dinner. And in his kennel, and black tie, of course. Kennel, one of the headlines in the papers read, "The new good form." Bless you. It was what he had always wanted, and yet Mr. Darling could not enjoy his new status in the community.
So Mr. Darling is kind of famous now?
Yeah.
Weird.
He's famous for being the man in the doghouse.
Okay.
Mrs. Darling was sad as well. When she managed to fall asleep, usually in her chair by the fire, she would dream of her children. This night was no different. Tonight, however, let us whisper in her ear that the children are on their way home. But perhaps we should not, because she has wakened with a start, calling out their names. There is a chill in the air, but the Darlings would never dare close the window. It must always stay open for the children. Little do they know that at this moment there is someone at that window. It is Peter. He has flown ahead with Tinkerbell. Jameson, don't do that. So now Peter is at the Darlings' house, at their window. Are Wendy, John, and Michael there yet?
I don't think so.
No. So what do you think Peter's going to do? We'll see. "Open," Peter muttered bitterly upon seeing the window. "I knew it would be." Peter came up with one final plan. He would fly in quietly, so as not to wake Mr. Darling in his kennel, lock the window, and then sneak out through the front door. That way, when Wendy and the boys arrived, they would think their parents had forgotten about them, and they would have to come back to Neverland. So Peter has a plan that he's going to do what? He snuck into the Darlings' house, and he's going to lock the window. That sounds like something we read in Kensington Gardens, too, doesn't it?
Yes, because in Kensington Gardens, he finally flew back and the window was locked, so he couldn't go in.
So his window was locked, so now he wants to do the same thing to Wendy, Michael, and John. That's not very nice. That's not nice, right? I think he's just doing that, though, because he's kind of lonely. He doesn't want them to leave him. Well, let's see what happens if he does it. "Oh, this is a brilliant idea," he thought. He didn't care about Wendy's or her mother's feelings, only about what he wanted. Children can be selfish that way. On his way back out of the house, however, Peter passed Mrs. Darling sleeping by the fire. Seeing the dried tears on her puffy face, he felt guilty for the first time. "I need her too," he wanted to shout. "We can't both have her." And that her he's talking about is Wendy. If you said Wendy, you're right. He jumped and sang and made funny faces, but as hard as he tried, he couldn't get poor Mrs. Darling's tears out of his head. Maybe he was growing up a bit after all. The thought enraged him. "Oh, fine," he huffed. "Come on, Tink." They unbarred the window and flew away. So did he go through with his plan?
No, he flew away.
No, he opened the window and then he flew away. So he's going to let them go home after all. He's growing up. Moments later, the children found the house and the open window. They landed softly on their old bedroom floor. Michael didn't even recognize the place.
No.
"This looks familiar," he said. "Of course, silly, it's our room," said John. "There's Nana's kennel," Wendy cried, and they all rushed to look inside. But in place of Nana, they saw a man. Who is it? "It's Father!" Wendy cried. Let me see a father," Michael begged. He didn't remember his father. He said, a little disappointed. The pirates were bigger. It is a good thing Mr. Darling was asleep and didn't hear his son, for it would have broken his heart. I'm sorry. "Did he always sleep in the kennel?" John asked, confused. Suddenly, Wendy couldn't remember either. Just then they heard the piano downstairs. "Mother!" Wendy gasped. "Aren't you our mother?" Michael asked. "Oh dear," Wendy said. Perhaps they had waited too long to come back. "Let's go downstairs and surprise her," John suggested. "We can yell, 'Boo!'" "Let's be a bit gentler," Wendy said. "We owe her that much. Let's get into our beds and she'll come in and find us." And that's exactly what they did. That's the end of chapter 16. What are Wendy, John, and Michael going to do? Now that they're back at home, what's their plan?
I think maybe they said that they're going to try and surprise her.
Yeah, John wanted to do that. He wanted to go say, "Boo!" But, did we think that was a good idea? No. She was like, let's not do it that way. Let's get in our beds. Let's just wait for her and she'll find us there. And then that will surprise her. So let's read. We're in chapter 17. It's called Growing Up and Goodbyes. In the picture, we see Mr. Darling in Nana's kennel in the doghouse. So we're going to see what happens when the parents find them. The next morning, Mrs. Darling walked into her children's bedroom, and there they were! Her babies, sound asleep as though they had never left. For a moment, she thought she must have imagined them leaving in the first place. If it were not for Mr. Darling asleep in his kennel, she wouldn't have been sure. Of course, the children were only pretending to sleep. Unable to stand the suspense any longer, they leapt from their beds, screaming, and ran to hug and kiss their mother. At the commotion, Mr. Darling crawled sleepily out of his kennel. Nana came running into the room as well. Outside, watching the Darling family reunion from a nearby tree, a little boy named Peter Pan shed a tear. He would never know such happiness, he thought. The other lost boys were a different story. Wendy had hidden them downstairs, but she summoned them now. She made them stand in a row in front of her mother. She wished they were not all still wearing their pirates' clothes. "Please take us in," the little pirates begged. "We don't need a lot," Nib said. "Of course we'll have you," Mrs. Darling cried at once, but Mr. Darling frowned. "It's an awful lot of boys," he said. Really, he just wished Mrs. Darling had not answered without asking him. "I just wish people wouldn't treat me like a nobody in my own house," he explained. "We don't think you're a nobody," Toodles said, and all the others agreed. "You are everything to me," Mrs. Darling whispered to him. Happy, Mr. Darling said he supposed they could make room, somehow. As for Peter, he was still outside, lingering. Wendy saw him and walked over to the window. "Oh, hello," he said casually, as if running into Wendy were a mere coincidence. "Peter," Wendy said, "please come inside. My parents will adopt you too." Mrs. Darling came over and stood beside her daughter. It's true, she said. You would send me to school and expect me to grow up, Peter accused. Deny it. But Mrs. Darling couldn't. I knew it, Peter cried. Keep back, madam. No one is going to catch me and make me be a man. I'm going back to Neverland. But I'll miss you so much, Wendy said. I brought back the boys. Perhaps that's enough. Maybe I should go back with you. Wendy turned to look at her mother. Oh, no, Mrs. Darling said quickly. But he needs a mother. So do you, sweetheart. Mrs. Darling could see that her decision pained Wendy and Peter, and so she agreed that Wendy could return to Neverland for 1 week a year to help Peter with the spring cleaning. Yeah. So what is the deal that Wendy and Peter and Mrs. Darling just made?
That Wendy can return 1 time a year
to help
spring
Peter.
cleaning.
So she can go back to Neverland to help Peter once a year. Let's see. You want that? How about that? Peter was happy with this. He had no sense of time anyway. He bade Wendy goodbye and said that he would be back in the spring. The boys went to school. They learned many things, but eventually they forgot how to fly. They said it was because they were not practicing, but in truth it seemed that they no longer believed. And besides, they no longer had fairy dust to help them. Michael held on to his belief far longer than the others, and Peter did come back, as he'd promised, at the first sign of spring. Wendy had grown up since he'd seen her last, and she was worried he would notice. He didn't. As usual, he thought and talked mainly about himself. She had been looking forward to reliving old adventures, but Peter had so many new ones since theirs, he didn't even remember them. Who is Captain Hook? He asked. You don't remember killing him and saving all our lives? I forget them when they are gone, Peter replied. The next spring, Wendy waited, but Peter never came back. Maybe he's sick, Michael said. Maybe we just imagined him. Wendy cried at that. Could it be? But the following year, Peter came as planned. He didn't even seem to realize he had missed a year. And that was the last time a girl named Wendy ever saw a boy named Peter Pan. No. That's kind of sad, huh?
That is a little sad.
Years later, when Wendy was married and living in the house she had grown up in, and all of the Lost Boys were men, she had a little girl named Jane who loved to ask questions about Peter. Some days, Wendy could barely remember him. She had already forgotten many details, and was glad to tell someone about him before she forgot him entirely. I know all about him, Mama, Jane said. Wendy looked up, startled. You do? She asked. I know him too, Jane said. Of course she did, Wendy realized, smiling sadly. All children did. One day, Wendy was sitting on Jane's bed. She had just finished putting Jane to sleep when Peter flew in through the open window and dropped onto the floor. He was the same as ever. Hello, Wendy, he said, as though no time had passed. Where are John and Michael? He looked down at Jane. Who's that asleep? Peter, Wendy said gently. That's Jane, my daughter. You two have already met in her dreams, if I am not mistaken. Peter wouldn't meet her eyes. He didn't want to admit that Wendy was grown up. I don't know what you're talking about, he said firmly. It's time for spring cleaning, and you promised to come. I can't, Wendy said. I don't remember how to fly. I'll teach you again. Peter seemed about to cry, so Wendy stood up to hug him. But when she did, she loomed so tall above him, obviously a grown-up, that his eyes opened wide in alarm, and he gasped, It's true, Peter, she said. I'm grown. No, you promised. I couldn't help it, she said. I'm married now, and a mother. Peter started to cry, so Wendy went downstairs to get him some warm milk. While she was gone, his sobs woke Jane. She knew at once who the boy was. By the time Wendy returned, Peter was once again laughing, and Jane was flying around the room with him, giggling. He needs a mother, Mama, Jane said. I know, Wendy said sadly. Peter pulled Jane over to the window with him, and she went willingly. "Oh, no," Wendy said, moving between them, just as her own mother once had. "Just for spring cleaning?" Jane begged. Wendy shut her eyes. "All right," she whispered, and just as Jane would with her own daughter, and Jane's daughter would with her own daughter after that, Wendy watched her baby fly into the sky and off to Neverland until she was as small as the smallest star. Then, turning from the window, she whispered "Good night" to Peter and to Jane and to you. And that's the end. The end. What did you guys think of Peter Pan? Leave your response in the comments on the video. Good night.
See you tomorrow.
Good night.